Welcome back to This Week in Creationism, special edition this time. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and usually I'm taking a look at some headlines in the world of creationism from the past week or two. But in this case, I'm focused on a particular person from the world of creationism. That person is Dr. Gabriela Haynes. She is Ken Ham's newest PhD employee. And I thought we'd spend a little time looking into her credentials. What did she study? What expertise does she have? And then we'll look at what she's doing at Answers in Genesis. What are her jobs there? And some things that she's written for Answers in Genesis. And then we're going to compare that to her PhD or her doctoral thesis. And ask some questions about just what is the goal that Ken Ham and others have by employing PhDs for their what they call their research department. And how much authority they really have to talk on the particular topics that they are given to talk about when they're employed by Answers in Genesis. Okay, with that rambling introduction, let's talk about Dr. Gabriela Haynes coming up. Welcome back. Now, I know a few of you are wondering, what in the world is Joel Duff going to talk about? Because I just watched a video a few days ago by the exact same title. And so I'm curious, what are we going to learn new about Dr. Haynes that we didn't know before? I can tell you that this video is going to be very different than the prior one. There's a tiny bit of overlap. And what you're going to learn new is that I made a big mistake in that previous video. And so some of what I talked about was not entirely accurate. No, that's not fair. It was completely inaccurate. And so I need to make amends for that. And I've done a reanalysis of Dr. Haynes's background. And I've actually found some really intriguing stuff. And I think that if you are willing to stick around for version number 2, there's some fascinating things about her history that I think we'll be able to tease out and have some interesting things to talk about. Let's put it that way. So before we get going on that, let's introduce you to Dr. Gabriela Haynes. She's been an employee with Answers in Genesis since late 2019. And there she is at the Answers News desk. Answers News is their bi-weekly program where she and others, she's become one of the main hosts. She and other employees at Answers in Genesis get together and they talk about recent headlines in science and actually a lot of cultural headlines as well. And they reflect upon those and how we ought to interpret these stories that we hear from the mainline news within a biblical worldview context, especially within the context of Genesis. And so that's one of her primary roles, but she's also on the research team at Answers in Genesis. And we'll get to the importance of that later. That second picture there below that is, there you can see Dr. Haynes with Ken Ham, and they're down in Brazil. And that's something else you should know about Dr. Haynes, is that she's from Brazil, and we're going to see that her research was done in Brazil, and her degree is from an institution in Brazil. And there she's hosting with Ken Ham a Answers in Genesis conference in Brazil. And that alone is, I think, interesting because it shows that there's enough of an interest in young earth creationism outside the United States. Answers in Genesis has become more and more and more international over time as they, in a way, sort of send out missionaries, right, into the rest of the world to spread their young earth creationism gospel. So why am I talking about Dr. Haynes now? She's been with Answers in Genesis for a couple of years. And she hadn't escaped my notice, but I hadn't really thought a whole lot about what she's doing there because I didn't see a lot of what she was doing there. All I saw her was on Answers News, and I just thought she was there to be a spokesperson for Answers in Genesis. But then she began to write a couple articles that are a little more in depth and supposedly in her field. And it's when I read this latest article, The Debate Over the Classification of Archaeopteryx as a Bird, that I then began to, how shall I put it? I began to really question her qualifications to write on these topics as an expert. After all, this is what Ken Ham does, right? He hires people that have PhDs and then promotes them as experts. And so therefore, via their PhD, you should listen to these. They're going to give you the answers because they have this experience. Even if it comes from the secular world, they can take that and now they can put their biblical eyes and perspective on it and tell you how you should understand this data from that world. Well, that assumes that they understand the data, all right, from their training, and that they have a wide experience in various areas of science or fields of science, so that they can speak authoritatively on those. And especially on Answers News. Answers News, they're talking about lots of topics, not just paleontology. She has a PhD in geology/paleontology. We're going to look at what that means in a moment. But she talks about everything, right? And this is also typical for people at Answers in Genesis, is they may have a PhD in one thing, but rarely are they actually discussing the thing that their PhD or their field of study, their background is in. They're often way off on different tangents, but nonetheless, their PhD seems to confer them some sort of magical ability to have a wide understanding. Now, don't get me wrong. There are people who have a wide understanding of things and can talk authoritatively, expertly on a variety of highly divergent topics. They're just amazing that way. And they've done a massive amount of background research and have intimate knowledge of so many fields. But that's not everybody. And so just having that PhD doesn't just automatically give you the right to be, trusted. And I'm saying that coming to you as a PhD, right? I have a PhD in biology. And if you listen to my station, you know that I talk about a lot of things that go well beyond biology. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that I am not a trained expert in many of those different fields. And therefore, I need to do enough background research to feel comfortable that I am promoting views that are accurate. And I have to build trust with my audience by doing that research. That's one of the things that's a little bit embarrassing about making this particular video, is that I made a big mistake, which I'm going to show you in a little bit, in terms of my research about Dr. Haynes. I managed to stumble into finding some incorrect information about her, which I shared on a previous video, which is why I'm remaking this video. Because honestly, I am embarrassed that I was duped, that I duped myself into believing one thing and not pushing it just that little bit further. It's so easy to do when you don't have firsthand knowledge. But I digress. I come back to this paper. It's when I read this paper that I began to really think to myself, I need to find out more about who Gabriela Haynes is. Is she an expert in this field, and so therefore able to assess how much, what is her capacity to assess this kind of data? Because here she's writing about this bird-dinosaur distinction, which is a big, topic among young Earth creationists, and there's a lot of controversy even among young Earth creationists about exactly how you call that separation between dinosaurs and birds. And are there organisms that are very dinosaur-like that could have had feathers and could have flied but aren't birds, but that should be classified possibly more like dinosaurs? Answers in Genesis is going to take, and is taking, and I think Dr. Haynes is maybe being put on the front line of this, is like, hey, we've got Ken Ham's like, I've got this PhD paleontologist now, right? And I'm going to give this project to her to say, let's make a definitive statement about what's a bird and what isn't. And a place to start would be take this very famous fossil, Archaeopteryx, and analyze it and say, it's a bird or it's a dinosaur. It was created on this day or it's created on that other day. And there can't be any squishy area in between. I'm not here to talk about this particular paper. I'm just here to say that this paper made me suspicious. that Dr. Haynes isn't really prepared, that she doesn't have the background knowledge and hasn't been trained in areas that would allow her to authoritatively talk on this particular topic, even though she's presented at Answers in Genesis as having, sort of that authority via what? Via her PhD in a field that sounds like it would allow you to be an expert in this. But as we're going to see, her specific area of research is on fossils, all right, so hence the paleontology, but fossil insects. And fossil insects are something very different than fossil vertebrates. And so we'll get to looking at her dissertation a little bit and talking about some aspects of it. But let me move on. But before I move on, I want to say if you're skeptical about me just sort of making a blanket statement that I don't trust this particular paper and that maybe I didn't say it this way, but so I'll say it. I found an enormous amount of erroneous information in this paper. I thought it was particularly bad, right? For Answers Research Journal, yes, I'm always going to disagree with things in there. And a lot of those things are disagreements about interpretation. The thing that scared me about this article, or I thought was disconcerting, and I think should be disconcerting to young Earth creationists, is that I found there to be a lot of just basic errors, right? Basic errors in the understanding of the fundamental science that she's talking about. Basic errors in terms of reporting the facts and the selection of what characters she reports. There's a lot of mistakes that I can pick out, and I am not an expert paleontologist, and I'm not an expert in this field, and I don't know Archaeopteryx that well, but I know it enough to be able to easily find and pull out errors from this paper. And if you want to hear about those errors in even greater detail and with finding a lot more errors than I did, I would go over to the Dapper Dinosaur channel, and he has a video there, 2-hour video going line by line through this paper and discussing all the elements of this paper from somebody who really knows their dinosaurs very, very well. And I'll put a link to that below this. But we must move on. What does Answers in Genesis tell us about who Dr. Haynes is? Right? She's being presented as having a PhD. How much background information is provided? Well, here's the blurb that is almost all you can find out about her if you search on the Answers in Genesis website. Dr. Haynes earned a PhD in geology and paleontology from the Federal University of Ceará State in Brazil, South America, in conjunction with the University of Kentucky. She serves in the research department at Answers in Genesis. I didn't know that until I read this. And collaborates in the Answers in Genesis International Outreach Ministry as a translator and reviewer for Portuguese language. All right, and as you see up there, it says paleontologist and co-host of Answers News. That's where I've seen her, and I think that's her publicly facing image at Answers in Genesis, is that she's seen very frequently on Answers News. So what do we know about Dr. Haynes? We don't really know anything from looking at her profile at Answers in Genesis, because we just know what her degree is in and what she's doing there. But they don't provide any links to her dissertation. They don't provide a link to any previous publications. They don't provide links to any of her other previous works or what she's been involved with. And so it took some hunting. It took a lot of hunting to find out about her previous work. But eventually I found Gabriela Carine Roca de Carvalho, and I'm sure I'm misspelling that or missaying that. I apologize, Dr. Haynes. And this is her own written profile from 2016. So while she was doing graduate work in Brazil, and explains to us she has a biology degree, and then she has a master's in geoscience with an emphasis on invertebrate paleontology, and then eventually a PhD from this Brazilian university. But while she's doing her PhD, she also came and visited the United States and worked at the University of Kentucky. Presumably there's a lab there where she was able to participate in research there. At the same time, not very far away, is the Answers in Genesis. And it's pretty clear from this and what's presented at the Creation Museum and her other written works at Answers in Genesis, now that I've explored it a little bit further, that she had an association with Answers, an informal association with Answers in Genesis during the time that she was working on her graduate degree. And that will become more interesting as we move along here. I promise this will get more interesting. So where I want to start is we're building some backstory here in order for me to explore some ideas and thoughts I have about how people come to get graduate degrees and become young Earth creationists. So here we have a paper, an article written for Answers in Genesis by Dr. Haynes from 2019. So right around the time that she starts, or actually this might actually have been published before she began there. And here she is talking about Santana fossils. Now, Santana is the name of a group of geological formation in Brazil, and this is where a certain set of fossils are found, and those are the fossils that she worked on for her dissertation, and I think her master's degree as well. And so here she says she's recounting her experience studying the Santana Formation in Brazil and how it highlights the catastrophic effects of a global flood in South America. All right, so that's what this article is going to be about. You know, I looked at these fossils and I am delighting in the fact that they are showing that the Bible is true and accurate in its description of a global flood, particularly now here in South America. First sentence there. The fine details preserved in fossils mystify evolutionists, but not paleontologists who believe in the Genesis flood. And so she believes in the Genesis flood, and she's a paleontologist. She's not mystified, but others who look at these same fossils are mystified by these amazing fossils of insects. And then we find out here, we said, during the last year of college, I started working at a geological park. All right, so as an undergraduate, right, and as a biology student. And again, I was surrounded by fossils from the Santana Formation. I realized that this formation is what the Lord wanted me to study as a biblical creationist working in a field filled with evolutionary assumptions. So she's calling herself a biblical creationist at this time of even before going to graduate school. I felt the burden to dig up the wonderful truths these fossils teach about the catastrophic effects of God's judgment during the worldwide flood recorded in Scripture. So she goes into graduate school with this burden on her that she needs to find these truths of the Bible in the fossils that she's now going to investigate and show how they demonstrate the catastrophic effects of the global worldwide flood. Right? There are so many different kinds of creatures that for my master's program, I needed to narrow down which group to study. I decided to research a vast group called the Hymenoptera, which includes the wasps, ants, and bees. Right? So they became her new favorite. You know, she's talking about how she can look at these great details in the fossil record and from those details be able to identify species, genera, families of different types of these fossils from the fossil record. And this is what she does for her dissertation. For all of her graduate work, she's doing a lot of descriptions of fossils, right? Looking at fossils, describing and measuring characteristics, comparing it to other known fossils, and figuring out how many different members of these particular groups of organisms are there in the fossil record in this particular location. A little farther down in the same article, I'm highlighting some sentences that will then contrast and compare to her dissertation. Secular scientists don't know how so many fossils could be preserved so well. I think that's kind of a ridiculous statement. There's lots of ways, that these insects could be preserved so well, and many scientists have many ideas about how that could happen. But in this Answers in Genesis article, scientists don't know how these could be well preserved. It's almost as if they were buried and fossilized while still alive, right? Building this idea that, hey, the obvious explanation is a global flood. And then look down here in the bottom. As a creation scientist, my starting point is the Bible. I believe that fossils found in the Santana Formation are the result of Noah's flood recorded in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, and the evidence fits nicely with that assumption. Right? The evidence fits nicely with that assumption. I'm going to show you some of the evidence that she presents in her work, all right, in her scientific research that she has published. And I'm going to show you some of what she has said and published, and we'll see how nicely it fits, okay, with Noah's flood. We as Christians know the answer for this sudden burial. The Bible explains it very well. Whenever I heard comments about the puzzle of such fine preservation, I often said to myself, It's because these fossils didn't take million years to be formed. They formed catastrophically. Sadly, simply because I was a Christian who believed in creation, I could not openly speak about my perspective. But now that I have finished my doctorate program, I can and will. So here we have her very clearly stating and admitting that she was a biblical creationist, all right, a creation scientist, when she was in graduate school. She was very much under the influence of Answers in Genesis' material. And she did her entire graduate degree listening to talk and studying and actually speaking herself about how these fossils were formed in her dissertation. We'll look at that. All the while knowing that she didn't really believe that most of what she says is not true. Now, I think the facts that she reports in terms of the descriptions of the fossils themselves are the facts, right? Those are things that that I think are honest and accurate. But then when you try to explain how these facts fit into the history of the Earth, right? That's where she's describing how to understand these fossils in her dissertation in a completely different way than she's describing right here. And she's saying, well, because I was a Christian, I couldn't speak about my perspective. So I spoke a different perspective. I spoke in different words, right, before. Now that she has her doctorate, she's pretty much just saying sayonara to that life, right? She's saying, I got my PhD now. Now I can go off, use my PhD to teach others what I really want to say. And I want to reinterpret all of my past evidence, within a different perspective with different worldview glasses on. So it's as if I put these other glasses on and spoke that language through those glasses. Now I'm going to speak a different language through these other glasses of a biblical or Genesis worldview. Okay, with that little bit of background, let's take a look at her dissertation. All right, so here we have the Hymenoptera, members of the Hymenoptera from a particular formation, the Santana Formation, right, in Brazil, and that's her dissertation. And here is the abstract. And the abstract is an overview of what her entire dissertation is about. And this is in English, fortunately, because most of the whole rest of the document is in Portuguese. But there is a Portuguese abstract, and then there is an English abstract. And in the English abstract, we see the sentence I've highlighted here. It also presents the current state of knowledge of the fossils in this order. So he starts out saying, I'm going to look at specimens of Hymenoptera, and that's an order of sawflies, wasps, bees, and ants. They're found in a limestone member of this particular formation, which is a particular geological age. And then she says, it also presents the current state of knowledge of the fossils of this order, as well as the taphonomy. Taphonomy is the study of how things get preserved. Ecology, like how do these organisms, by looking at the different kinds of insects that are present in a particular layer of rock, we might be able to say something about what the environment was like in that particular area at that particular time. That you see where we're going to go here now? Because that she doesn't believe that that she's actually looking at anything from a particular time, since this is all just a jumbled up mass that was all preserved at one time. And it doesn't represent an ecology, really. And paleogeography of the families. So the distribution of a family, particular families of insects, where they're found in different rock formations in the world, and correlating them with different times, found in this particular early Cretaceous period. All right, so I think we're looking at a period between, 113 million and 126 million years ago by conventional dating. So she studied a bunch of different specimens from different collections, and those collections weren't ones that she went out and collected. Those are things that rocks that people have other collected. They're in a lab, and she's just taking all those, looking at them, finding different insects in them, and then trying to identify them as precisely as she can, down to species or families and so forth. And so then she describes several new members that are unique, that no one has ever seen before, and gives descriptions to them. So a large portion of her dissertation is those descriptions, all right, giving names to things and comparing them to other ones that are known, showing how they're different. All right, and then down toward the bottom here of her abstract, we see the Hymenoptera of the credo member are preserved, and here she's going to describe how they're preserved. They're preserved by mineral substitution, articulated with open wings and extended legs, showing more number of female specimens than males, without known larvae. It is a fauna not very distinct from the main known, and I don't know what this word is, Eocetacea Hymenoptera faunas. I think that might be early Cretaceous. Sharing some genera and sharing some genera, meaning there's similar taxa, there's similar fauna to these other locations, and that's the biogeography part. So in Spain, Mongolia, China, and so forth, these other places in the world that have the same aged rocks from the conventional geological column. So if you go another place in the world where that 113 to 126 million year time period is, you can find very similar, if not the same, fossils as she is finding in this particular rock. So she's doing that comparison, showing that they are also found in these other locations. That's going to be interesting too. I keep promising things are going to be interesting. I promise they will be. There'll be something in here. Let's just pull out some other words from her dissertation. So scanning down a couple pages, we find, and here's if you can read Portuguese, great. Otherwise, I use Google Translate, which obviously has a little bit of trouble with some of the scientific language. Here we have, disagreeing about that, we're doing geology now. She's talking about the geological situation where these fossils are found, and she's talking about taphonomy. Taphonomy is like how they're preserved, right? The science of preservation of organisms. And she's describing the location from Neo-Jurassic age, deposited respectively in lacustrine. Lacustrine means lake sediments. So identified lake sediments versus like oceanic sediments or sediments from rivers or something like that, right? So they're in a lacustrine environment, freshwater environment. And also other portions of this formation are in fluvial or wind deposits and constitute the record of a large and shallow basin area, right? So this area of Brazil at one time she's describing is a large basin that has lakes in it, fluvial system where you have streams and rivers, and there's also wind deposits of various sediments, right? That's the description of the geology, the geological context of where these fossils are found. Obviously nothing here about a global flood, because the Middle Cretaceous, by every young Earth, 99.9% of young Earth creationists, is a flood deposit. It was deposited all like in one big time during that 1 year of the global flood. And so it certainly wasn't a lacustrine environment. It certainly wasn't there weren't meandering valleys and wind deposits or any of that stuff. None of that is possible in the Cretaceous. It all has to be underwater and all mixed. Yeah, and then a little bit farther down, actually at the bottom of that same paragraph, we find fine sandstones, clearly siltstands of fluvial origin, again, flowing water, but not like rushing global water tsunamis. We're talking about meandering streams and small rivers that create fluvial deposits. There's a succession of fluvial deposits, meaning there's one group of water laid down sediments, but in slow moving, not fast moving water locations on top of one another, suggesting a series of events, right, over many, many years. And then down there at the bottom, fruit of intertwined, I don't know how the word got translated, fruit. I'm not exactly sure what word that should have been. Intertwined and meandering currents of a certain age, right? The meandering currents, right, of a fluvial system. You can think of like an alluvial fan, right, where the water is just going out and then into a lake, right, into your lacustrine large lake system. Right. So this dissertation is, throughout, it's seeped full of this kind of language, which is the language of describing a ecosystem, a world that existed back in time where these insects were living and they were deposited in these types of environments. But this other article that she wrote for Answers in Genesis says that evolutionists have no answers for how these were preserved, right? They scratched their head like, how could these insects be so well preserved? But she knows the answer. It's a global flood. But in her dissertation, she's talking about it as if this is the way it's preserved. Now, she's just reading the literature and then grabbing that stuff from the literature. But in doing so, she's saying, here's, this is the best we know. And she's writing as if this is her position, right? There's nothing in here that qualifies this as, well, the best hypothesis we have today is this. It's more like this is the description of it, and I'm not disagreeing at all that these are the conditions in which these insects are found. Let's go to the objectives. So some of her objectives are, the main objective of this thesis is to identify and describe the forms of Hymenoptera fossils collected in laminated limestone. Laminated limestone, all right, which is found in the bottom of lakes. And laminated would be thin little layers, all right, where you have sediments coming down to the bottom of the lake and forming fine, thin, silty or clay layers. And that's where the fossils are, that's where these insects are preserved, or in these fine sediments, in these laminated limestones. All right, that can be explained in lacustrine lake environments, especially lake environments that may be fairly deep and then be anoxic at the bottom where there's no oxygen. So you have insects that fall in the lake and then sink down to the bottom. They're going to be in non-oxygenated environments, and they're going to be laying there, and they're not going to decay, and they're going to get covered with fine sediments. Sure enough, you crack open those laminated layers and you're going to see beautiful fossils. All right, potentially millions of years later. So for her to say that, scientists don't have any answers for how this happens, she's providing the answers in her dissertation. She has written about this. She knows what scientists say and think are the answers. It's improper to say that scientists don't have answers or they scratch their heads and they don't know what to say to this. This thesis has the following specific objectives. Know the largest number of specimens of the order in the collections of research institutions, museums, laboratories of paleontology in the Brazilian universities. So let's figure out what we know about this region from our own sources. Present the state of the art of fossil Hymenoptera in this particular basin. Summarize paleogeographic information on families, the distribution of those families across different rock formations in the world. Families, genera, and species of the fossils that are described. And then compare the main Hymenoptera fauna, all the different types of Hymenoptera, and analyze current biological, ecological, and taphonomic effects and compare them with the fossils. So that, in a nutshell, is the things that she tries to accomplish in her dissertation. All right, so that's just some tidbits from her dissertation. Now I want to go and look at her only peer-reviewed publication that includes, I'll call it collected data. And so this paper in a geology journal in Brazil, she's first author on this paper, and I do want you to note the date on it. So the dissertation was from 2017. And her master's, I'm not exactly sure when she earned her master's. But 2011 would have been at the beginning or before she began her master's and PhD work. And so here she has a publication which she's first author from 2011, doesn't have any publications after that except for her dissertation. And a lot of the items in this particular paper are in a portion of her dissertation. So I don't know if she had a lot of work done for her dissertation and it just took a long time to finally finish it up in 2016 or 2017 and actually get the degree. I don't know what the situation is there, but I find it interesting. This is all the way back in 2011. This is a really fascinating paper. Fascinating to me because of the worldview she's presenting here, and in my mind, the incredible blinders one has to have on when one looks at the data and has to, I looked at this and I was like, I don't know how I would look at this and not ask myself some questions about why we're seeing the patterns we're seeing. Because I don't know how a young Earth creationist interprets the evidence that she presents in this paper that she has published. So let me go ahead and let's read the abstract real quick. This paper summarizes the occurrence of fossiliferous families of Hymenoptera. So it's the same area that she's interested in, right? The ants and bees and so forth. And their distribution in geological time, and placing the Aptian fossils. The Aptian is a particular age within the Cretaceous. And that's why I'm saying 113 to 126 million years ago. That's the Aptian. Of the I can't say that, Arapaima Basin, northeastern Brazil. In a regional and global context, the presence of Hymenoptera in the Triassic is rare. So the Triassic is Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. So if you go way back, much farther, another 100 million years earlier, you get to the Triassic, is very rare. So this whole group of Hymenoptera, of what is thousands of different species and hundreds of different types of insects, in the Triassic is very rare. But from the Jurassic time, they're relatively common. The Hymenoptera throughout geological history are mainly represented by wasps. The ants appeared in the Hativerian, which is another age later on, and bees in the Campanian, right, which is yet later in time, about 40 million years after you see angiosperms in the fossil record. Angiosperms are flowering plants. So flowering plants are unknown in the fossil record up until like the early Jurassic are the first ones, but they're not common, and there's a very small diversity of angiosperms, flowering plants. They don't really go crazy until the Cretaceous period. This suggests, so now here's interpretation going on here. This suggests that the Apidea record, that's the bees, must be older, or that some wasps performed a role in flower pollination. All right, I mean, you have bees after the origin of some flowers. And flowers can be pollinated by a lot of different things. It doesn't have to necessarily be bees, but you could suggest that maybe wasps were primary pollinators originally, and then the bees evolved and they sort of took over that main role, or are more common in that role. But you'll see that this is a description of trying to say here's the origin of these different groups over time. Of 52 families of Hymenoptera occurring in the early Cretaceous, 22 were mentioned in Siberia, so forth. So now they're doing comparisons with different parts of the world and showing that the same patterns occur in other places of the world. So what we see in Brazil is also seen in other parts of the world. In other words, there's consistency across different parts of the world where you see the same age rock, you see the same types of fossils, you see the same order where different organisms show up at the earliest moments, at the earliest time. A picture is much better than those words and me reading them. So he has a number of different figures in this paper. And those figures, you don't have to be able to read these words. These things along here are different families. So the Hymenoptera is an order, and within that order of insects, there's a lot of different families, right? You have a bunch of different kinds of bee families. You have wasps, you have ants, you have aphids, it just goes on and on and on, these different things, right? These are the families' names. So each family has genera and species in it. And then up here is Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Tertiary, and then Quaternary. And of course, the Holocene is like we're right here. Oh, you probably can't see that because my head's there. We're right here at the very, very end. Right? And just to orient yourself, because now we're coming to the nub of the issue here. Right here, at the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of what's called the Paleogene. That is the point where most creationists, and especially the ones that Answers in Genesis and her colleague Andrew Snelling, who probably hired her, believe that the flood boundary is. In other words, all of this was made by a global flood, like all deposited in one big flood over one very short period of time. And then after here, all of this is deposited after the flood. And what you're seeing in this figure, in this paper that she is the primary author on, is she's saying what we know about the fossil record is this. There's this family. It's extinct. You see members of the family first show up here at the end of the Jurassic, and then you see members of them present in various rock formations, and then they disappear somewhere up here. right? And then we don't see any of the members of that. We've never seen a living one, right? So we presume they're extinct. There's another family of a different type of insect we only see in the Jurassic and we never see again. Then we see another family that has a small distribution, so it only lasts for, in conventional age, it's only around for 40 million years, right? And then we don't see it anymore. Well, now you keep going on down here, and what you'll see is, okay, right, here's the distribution in the geological column of where you find these fossils. And some groups are found in the Jurassic, and then we have living members still present with us today. Now, they're not exactly the same species. You see the species are different in the past than they are in the present, but they are generally identifiable in the same family of organisms. All right, now what does this make you think when you look at this? I mean, the natural explanation for this would be if this really is time, all right, if this is time running through here, and these really are successive ages or times in Earth's history, then what you have is you have the non-existence of all these different families of insects. And then at some point, they start showing up in the fossil record. Right? An evolutionary biologist would say that it's at that point that some insect become different enough from other insects. They had enough different characteristics. We can identify them as being unique, new individuals, new groups, that we then give a family name. And then they progress through time, still changing through this time, but nonetheless have enough similar characteristics that we call them members of the same family. And some groups come into existence, but they also, something happens and they go out of existence. How does this happen how do you get this pattern with a global flood explanation? Right? How do you get this pattern? Right? This suggests that this family down here only is only found in one section of the global flood. So they're not ever found in post-flood sediments. So there's no evidence they lived after the flood. There's no evidence that they lived before the flood, other than any fossils really in flood sediments are presumed to be organisms that lived before the flood. But how did they not get preserved early in the flood? I mean, these are tiny little insects. Why is it that the members of this family consistently are found in rocks of certain ages? And some of these are found in one part of the world, and you go to another part of the world, and it's at the same age period where you find the same fossils. How does a global flood sort little tiny insects into patterns that make it appear that the organisms are living during different times under different environments and then disappear and go extinct? How does it make a pattern like this? I think any, like she says, reasonable person should look at this data and not reasonably go like, oh, it's obvious this is a global flood. She looks at the fossils and say, like, the only way you could actually get a preservation of these fossils is in a global flood. There's another problem. You see all this over here? This is after the flood. This is after the flood. This is after the flood. How do we know they're present in these different areas? Because we have fossils of them. Some of those fossils are fantastic looking. Those are after the flood. So we know that it doesn't require a global flood in order to get some very good fossil preservation, because fossils have formed after the flood and they look great. If fossils can form here and be preserved for millions of years, or for thousands of years, why do you have to argue that these fossils have to have formed during a global flood? They could be local floods. They could be the same kind of conditions that occurred after the flood that preserved them. To reiterate this point, she goes through all these different families. And here we're seeing the families that occur very early in the Jurassic. Remember she said in the Triassic there's almost nothing? Well, look at the early Triassic. There's only one type, one family that can be identified that is any relationship to the Hymenoptera. Before this, there are no Hymenoptera in the fossil record. And there's a lot of fossils, right? There's a lot of geological column below this that has lots of other insects, right? It's got dragonflies and beetles and all kinds of other stuff exist before this. I might have misspoken about beetles. Dragonflies for sure. Lots of other fossils of insects prior to this point, but no Hymenoptera. how would a global flood preserve bees, wasps, all these other types of, like thousands of species of Hymenoptera, but somehow only preserve them in the top layers of the flood? How does that happen? How does it sort those from all the other insects? Because those other insects are also preserved in this layer too. I mean, there's dragonflies throughout the whole thing. Now watch this pattern. So at first you have one Hymenoptera, and then if you go a little later in time, you have multiple types of Hymenoptera, more variation, in other words, within that group. And if you go a little later in time, you'll find there's more groups of Hymenoptera. And if you go later in time, like the Cretaceous, you'll find there's other diversity of Hymenoptera. Now let's go to the next figure. These are all from the same paper. Here are other these are more families. We're talking a lot of families here. All right, and these families only show up in the late Jurassic. And then many of them, when they show up in the Cretaceous, go all the way through the present. This pattern makes no sense for a global flood. Okay, so at the end of the flood, some of these groups got preserved. Nothing of these groups got preserved before that, even though they're in a giant mixed up world of sediment from this massive flood covering the whole world. But somehow, these members of just these families only got preserved in the very top layers. And then they also happen to have lived after the flood, and they're also preserved after the flood in a similar way. So these fossils look very similar to these fossils, even though they're laid down under different conditions. It gets worse. Here's a whole bunch of other families. Lots of other families. Here, I just highlighted one of these. These are the aphids. A couple hundred species of aphids. The aphids are known. I did read that there is a type of thing that looks like it might be like an aphid that's a little bit old, like maybe goes back to the Cretaceous. But all of the living aphids look like they go back to a common ancestor that's only like 30 million years old. So here, remember, this is the flood right here, boundary. And so all this is in the post-flood. Here, all of these families, which include genera, which include species, so hundreds of species, there is no fossil record for anywhere in the world that's been observed yet. And then they appear here within like 10 million years. And then they exist to present. So these are all what we call modern types of Hymenoptera, modern groups of Hymenoptera. So when you put the three together, you see the Hymenoptera is getting more and more and more diverse. And you see today we have so many different types, so many different families of Hymenoptera. But the farther back you go down the fossil record, you have fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer families present. And then you have none. There's not a clean break point. There is nothing I can dream up from a flood hypothesis that would be able to explain this particular pattern. And she's writing about this pattern, and she's writing about it as if this is the evolution of these organisms, that they're coming into the world at these various times, and that's why they're preserved at these different times, because that's when they appear. That's when they're first available to get preserved in the fossil record. I haven't seen anything from her writing in which she's been able to reinterpret this data and put the biblical worldview spin on this, at least her biblical worldview spin, of how you explain these fossils in a flood context. Wow. It just kind of boggles my mind that she can write an article and say that geologists and paleontologists have no idea how to explain these things, that they don't see the world the right way, and they're constantly, fumbling around for answers. But if you put your biblical glasses on, it's obvious these were all generated in a global flood. That's not the obvious answer from the very evidence she presents in her own work, and even describes it as being this is a rational way of looking at it. I mean, that's the way you read the dissertation, is this is a way of understanding it. Now, what I'm not going to show you is she has a bunch of maps in her dissertation. And those maps are of the world, And interestingly, it's showing the world with different plate conformations. You know, the plates where the Africa and Africa and South America are closer together, and they're squished together in different ways. And what she has on there is like, here's where my fossils are in South America. And for this particular group of fossils, this particular family, there are also members of that same family in these other places in the world. And at that time, the rocks that are forming in that part of the world 113 million years ago, and the rocks over here in what is now Brazil 113 million years ago, they have similar ecologies, right? There's similar types of insects in those two different locations. And I'm sure if you looked at the plants, there are like similar types of plants in those locations, in those same rocks, right? How can she look at that and say that's obvious that that's a global flood that did that? Because honestly, the entire dissertation doesn't mean anything if the global flood is true. Like everything she did for her dissertation, other than just the literal descriptions of like, here's what was there in this rock. That is like, I'm describing a fact. That's what's in the rock. But what use is it to describe these things if you're going, yes, like, how can I get that? I'm trying to remember what I said last time because I said it much better in the previous video I made. I'm a little frustrated right now with my inability to connect my thoughts. Okay, let's put it this way. As she's sitting here doing this work and describing these things, I can understand describing things in rocks and just saying, okay, here's what is in this rock, and here's what's in this rock, and here's what's in this rock. But what does she believe this entire time she's doing it? I already showed you she was definitely a young Earth creationist when she did this work. And so as she's looking at these rocks and looking at these fossils, what does she believe they are? She believes that they are a record of insects that had lived before the flood. So these are insects that are flying around 3,500 years ago, 4,500 years ago, before Noah's flood. And so they're living in some environment before the flood. And all of a sudden, the world gets turned upside down. And all the things that were alive before the flood, all the things, right? Everything in the ocean, everything in the sky, every plant in all the different environments on the earth are suddenly upheaved, and then laid down in these sediments, thousands of feet thick, almost instantaneously, preserving all the organisms that were alive before the flood, at the very initiation point of the flood. And so what she's looking at is this little tiny layer. And she's saying, well, here's what's in this layer of what was deposited during this massive flood. Now, what can you interpret from that? You can't interpret what she did in her dissertation. She can't say that, well, in this particular layer, you have a similar layer in another part of the world that's dated the same age. And those two things represent the same ecology, the same environment. They don't represent the same environment. They represent the same sorting of stuff somehow. And they don't represent anything that is a reality that she's describing in her dissertation at all. You know, why even study these things? Because they're just a jumbled up mass. They're unable to inform you. Now, in my previous video, and now I'm remembering, I went on and on about, all the different interesting things you can find out by looking at fossils that are like laid down at a lake. You're learning what was the environment like 113 million years ago? What were the different kinds of organisms present? And then you find interesting relationships. Like there weren't any bees at this particular time. Not in the time she's looking at, but a little bit before that. There's no evidence of any bees. And then you look at the types of flowers that were present on the types of plants that are preserved in the same layer of rock. So if you presume those are the same age, and you look at those plants, you see those plants, you know what? They didn't have the same kind of flowers that ones do today that are specialized for attracting bees, right? They had other flowers that probably were more like moth-driven or driven by wasps or something like that. That makes sense within a context of a changing earth over time and adaptation of organisms to each other, creating different adaptations and different ecosystems over time. But within a global flood context, The world is just the world it is right before the flood, and then everything just gets mixed up, and there shouldn't be any like relatable ecological correlations between different places that have the same rocks and the same organisms. I don't even know how you get the same rocks and the same organisms in different places, especially since they're dated to the same radiometric date. I mean, even if you believe radiometric dates are bogus, to get the same dates for two rocks and have the same fossils in them in two different parts of the world, that's an incredible correlation, right? What a coincidence. To have that, it's not a coincidence in a old Earth changing world over time in which the whole globe experiences similar types of changes with respect to flora and fauna. That's not a coincidence. It makes perfect sense. It's a rational explanation. For a young Earth, it's just like you got to scratch your head and go like, I don't know how to explain that. Like, how would you get that pattern? And that's why I'm saying when she's writing her papers and she's showing these patterns and she's showing these distributions of organisms and talking about how they're similar in different places, and that's like a flora that particular time. She's describing very reasonably a time in the past in which the world looked that way. But she doesn't believe any of that. What you're looking at now, because I have to stop. All right, we've got to cut this off at some point. What you're looking at right now is my mistake. I told you I made a big error, and that's why I'm re-recording this video. This is a master's thesis. A master's thesis by Milagros Gabriela de Cruz Cardona. And when I first was doing my search for Dr. Gabriela Haynes, I stumbled upon this master's thesis. It was from a Brazilian institution that's the same institution that Dr. Haynes said that she got her PhD from, or for Answers in Genesis said she got her PhD from. And I looked through the dissertation, or this master's thesis, and it's all about describing insects in the fossil record from the Santana Formation. And I knew that she had written an article about the Santana Formation. And I've heard her talk on Answers News about the Santana Formation and her work there. So I found this thesis, and I was having trouble because she obviously hadn't done anything. I couldn't find her name, Gabriela Haynes, anywhere. And so I was figuring she did this under another name. And so this name has a Gabrielle in it, right? So it has Gabrielle in it. I'm thinking she changed her name from Milagros Gabriela de la Cruz Cardona to Gabriela Haynes. And so I assumed this was her work. And that's what I reported on my previous video. I talked about this particular master's thesis, and I critiqued it. Now, what's kind of interesting about all this is, and I'm really embarrassed that I found the wrong thesis and I ascribed it to her, and I want to apologize to Dr. Haynes for any critique I had of that thesis that wasn't her actual work. I will say it's kind of interesting, though, that the work is very similar. All right, I have to say it's descriptive work. It's mostly descriptive. This master's thesis is all descriptive, and that was mostly my comment, was this is descriptive work. They're not really doing the process of hypothesis building. And I would say that Dr. Haynes' dissertation doesn't have a lot of hypothesis. It really is a 95%, I'm just describing stuff. This was all descriptive. But here's the other reason I got tripped up. There is a epigraph at the beginning of her thesis, of this Gabriela's thesis. And there was this short little sentence here, and it said, right before it begins the abstract, and it says, insect origins beyond that point, the Carboniferous, are shrouded in mystery. It might almost seem that the insects had suddenly appeared on the scene. I was familiar with that particular phrase because I've seen it used by a young Earth creationist. But it was pointed out to me later. First, I had seen this particular phrase, and what did I immediately think? You'd understand that I would come to the conclusion that this person is probably putting that quote there for a reason. It's saying, I'm skeptical about the usual story about how insects originated, right? My master's thesis here, my dissertation is going to be about describing insects from the fossil record, but I want to let you know that I understand that it's kind of a mystery, and it almost looks like they suddenly appeared, which sounds a whole lot like saying It's kind of like the Bible says, they just appeared, right? They didn't evolve. And so this is really the thing that kind of like, oh, when I saw this combined with the descriptive work, combined with what Dr. Haynes said about working on the Santana Formation, and that's what this thesis was about, I think it's kind of understandable why I'd make the connection. It was pointed out to me later and that this quote is even more interesting because it's ascribed to A.E. Hutchins, and that's actually a misquote, right? And A.E. Hutchins should have been R.E. Hutchins, but in the young Earth creationist literature, they frequently, that somebody made a mistake somewhere because they found this quote. It's a great quote, so you use it for, like there's a list of quotes you can use to make points about, like, this is an evolutionary biologist who's saying this, so look, they're doubting the origins of insects. And somebody made a list. They included this particular quote, but they mangled the reference. And here we have this woman on her master's thesis using this quote, and they're using the wrong person's name. The only way they would make this mistake is they got it from the creationist literature, right? Rather than going back to the original source and quoting it from the original source, they would have realized their error. And so what's really fascinating here is they made an error that makes it obvious that this person is also a young Earth creationist, or at least influenced by young Earth creationist material. This particular person also wrote a master's thesis with the same advisor. And so here we have an advisor in an institution in Brazil that had two students, both of which appear to have leanings toward young Earth creationism. Anyway, it came to my attention that I was wrong, that I had found the wrong Gabriela. And so that's why I deleted my other video, and that's why I'm making this video. I think I found that this other video is more interesting. I mean, this second dissertation was more interesting because rather than finding a way to avoid talking about evolution, Dr. Haynes really just incorporates evolution into her dissertation. And she has lots of evolutionary ideas, right? Influences in her dissertation. And she doesn't resist any of those that I can see. And so in my mind, I have to say it feels like a form of lying, right? It feels like I don't believe this. I believe this is wrong. This is not what happened. This isn't real history. This can't be right. I'm even going to be saying that it doesn't make sense. But then you write as if it is right, it is correct, and that it does make sense. And so to do that, knowing that you don't believe it, that is lying, right? Now, I understand that in order to get your PhD, you felt like you couldn't say what you wanted to say, which I don't know how you'd write this dissertation and just say, none of this stuff is true. I'm going to describe these fossils, and I'm going to just conclude that they were caused by Noah's flood, because I think that would have been really interesting, because I think you would have then had to have come up with an actual hypothesis, right? That would be the hypothesis. You'd have to come up with evidence for it. And then you'd have to describe how you see the patterns you see within the context of a 1-year global flood. That would have been intriguing. I'd love to see that description. I'd love to see you think through that. Now, yes, you probably would have had difficulty getting a PhD from that particular organization doing that. And so I understand the desire by some to like secretly go through graduate school with the goal simply being, I just need to survive. I'll say whatever I have to say to get my degree. I'll keep myself quiet. But all the while, I know I'm just going to use that degree to then be an expert and use that as a witness. There are PhDs in creation science that let me give you something else to look at while I'm talking here. I know of PhDs in creation science who did not do it that way. I think they have legitimate PhDs that did real science, that had hypotheses. They learned the best and the most they could from the institution where they were, and they know their stuff. And they may have been creationists all along, but they let everyone know that. But they did excellent work in the field that they were in. and they have their degrees. And I don't bemoan them having a different opinion about how to interpret some data, and they're using their degree to do things that promote young Earth creationism. Yeah, I think they're wrong in some of their conclusions and so forth, but I don't have a big issue. It's kind of like there are plenty of scientists who get PhDs at institutions, and they go on to have, contrary views to things. They come to other views. And it might seem like it's an embarrassment to that institution, but what the institution is doing is we're going to teach you how to think and how to analyze data and how to do research. You may come to different conclusions than what the community, right, consensus is. This happens all the time, and it's not a Christian thing, right? It's not just a religious thing where people come to other versions of things. But this is a little different, right? This is a situation where I'm hiding my views. I'm not going to make any attempt to incorporate my views or talk about what I think and incorporate that into my research. But also, she didn't try to avoid doing research that would have her write about evolution, right? A lot of creation scientists have managed to get degrees in areas in which you could kind of get away with never talking about. I mean, look at Nathaniel Jeanson. He did like bioinformatics as an undergraduate, then did cell biology at Harvard. How could I forget Harvard, right? He did cell biology at Harvard, and did he have to interact with evolutionary biology? Probably hardly at all. I mean, go to a seminar and they might have mentioned something about evolution, but in his own research, it wouldn't have any impact, right? He could not know anything about evolution, and I happen to think he doesn't know much about evolution, but still today. But he never had any training in that area, and he never had to use any training in that area. He didn't have to know anything about it to do his particular research. Now, the thing is, he's left there and he's using his Harvard PhD in order to act like an expert in something he's not trained in. And as I said before, some people can do that. Some people can learn material outside their field and truly become experts in that and have something authoritative to say. But just because you have a PhD in a field from Harvard doesn't make you an expert automatically by default in those different areas. You have to prove yourself. Gabriela Haynes has a PhD in paleontology. She did paleontological work. I think it's just descriptive stuff. I think it's very limited. It's a very thin slice of paleontology. It's very focused just on, knowing some techniques to look at fossils, describe taxonomic stuff in insects. But then she goes on to Answers in Genesis, and she's like an expert in everything having to do with paleontology, including birds and dinosaurs. And I think that's a real stretch for her particular background, especially since she went through her entire program thinking like a young Earth creationist, not allowing herself to explore hypotheses and questions and assess data. She doesn't do really any analysis. There's virtually no analysis of data. Especially in what her paper's about that she just published, which is talking about cladistics, right? Analysis of how organisms are related to each other using data and statistical programs. She's talking about that, but she's never done any of that. She might have had a class where they talked about it, but none of her actual research engaged in that. So she doesn't have personal experience with those things. Yeah, unfortunately, I find that so far, I guess I'll say I'm not impressed with what she has done. She is using her degree and she's basically flaunting it, right? She's telling us that she never intended to really learn all that much about a particular field because it's filled with evolutionary thought. So she probably turned off her brain to doing and learning things other than just the technique she needed to be able to get this dissertation. So how do I finish this up? Where do I end here? I'm getting kind of worked up, and I'm calling Dr. Haynes a liar, and I hate to do that. I'm just really reticent to saying people are lying, but I've just come to I've been thinking about this topic a lot lately because I'm probably going to have a discussion with somebody else, and we're going to have this discussion about legitimacy of PhDs and how they're obtained and how you can assess people's actual expertise. What does it mean to be an expert? So I've been thinking about that topic of like what it means to be an expert and how do you identify somebody that is an expert. And a part of me says you kind of know it, when you see it. You can feel when somebody is an expert, which also means you can kind of feel when somebody's not an expert. And that's the way I feel with Dr. Haynes. She seems like a really nice person, very personable. I understand why she was hired by AiG with respect to her public face there in terms of being on Answers News. She's got a great accent, and she has been ensconced in Answers in Genesis material for a long time. You can just hear it in everything she says. Everything she says is basically a quote from Ken Ham, from one of his books. Like her response to every article, every single story that comes out, it's like the classic responses, like these one-liners that every creationist should know. And that's the other thing that makes me skeptical, that she hasn't actually experienced secular science. And what is Ken Ham? I think I started out with this. What is Ken Ham hoping to achieve by hiring people with PhDs who got PhDs at public institutions, not Christian colleges? He's hoping to get this feeling that he's putting somebody in front of his audience who he can say, this person has survived, learned from the secular world. They understand the way people think, and they have the expertise, right, in this field. But they can see things through the correct glasses, and they can help us now reinterpret this data. My problem is, and I've already said it, but I'm going to say it again, she's been in this Answers in Genesis envelope. It's obvious she's read all their work and only done the bare minimum in terms of understanding something about paleontology. Here's just the papers I need to read to understand this formation, to describe the geology there, and here's what I need to know about these insect groups and describe them and make lists of characteristics they have and decide which ones are species and family and genera. And then there would be some coursework involved where she had to be exposed to some other things. I don't know what exactly the training is like in Brazil, but I'm sure there is some coursework that also gave her some other experience. But her experience is pretty limited when you're not really there to really try to understand it, right? If you're not there to truly soak it in and like say, I want to understand this. It's more like, I just need to survive this, right? That's the sense I get. I was just there to survive getting this so I could have the PhD. So now I have the cachet to be able to get this job at Answers in Genesis. And it's pretty obvious she's working with Andrew Snelling because he's a PhD geologist and he's working on a project from Grand Canyon and he probably needs some help. And so I'm sure he's instrumental in hiring her. And I suspect she's going to be put out there to write a lot more of these types of articles that I've read from her recently. And I have to say the quality of work is probably lower than my opinion of a lot of other people at Answers in Genesis. And so that's not a good sign for the future of Answers in Genesis, that the employees they're getting now are pretty much been been fed upon Answers in Genesis material. So they're completely absorbed in that worldview right from the beginning or very early on. And it's any misconceptions that are in the young earth, creationist material, of which there are many, right, are then embedded in somebody and they have no chance to even see another perspective. And so they really aren't able to reflect upon the other evidence because they haven't really experienced it, which makes them doubly dangerous in a way, right? Because they are now reiterating errors, but they're reiterating them from what sounds to be a more authoritative platform. We got to stop. That's Dr. Gabriela Haynes. And I look forward to seeing what she does in the future. I'm sure we're going to be talking about her in This Week in Creationism many, many times. Thanks for hanging with me. Hey, subscribe, hit the like button, and we'll talk to you later on This Week in Creationism or whatever else I decide to talk about. Thanks a lot. Talk to you later.